We're coming up to the last week of our journey through Trinitarian doctrine, and now we come right up to date, but also, as so often, looking quite a long way back. We are delving into Givenness and Revelation by Jean-Luc Marion. This is quite a hard book, but it repays attentive reading. Also, hard as it is commendably short. Why not read the whole thing? Now, what you have to understand about Marion is that he occupies an unusual position, but one from which he sees some interesting things. Marion is both a theologian and a philosopher. As a theologian, he is an Orthodox Roman Catholic. As a philosopher, he is a phenomenologist. Why is this odd? Well, phenomenology is a kind of philosophy that doesn't usually get on well with Christianity. So let me tell you a little bit about phenomenology, and then show how Marion turns it round to say some really good things that need saying. The name we most associate with phenomenology is Martin Heidegger, a German who died in 1976. Heidegger is very influential, and personally I would say not for the good. He feeds into Sartre and into a lot of the thought of the 1960s, which is either destructive or liberating, depending on your point of view. Although he is a philosopher, Heidegger's philosophy has implications for theology, and he is definitely pulling in a different direction from Barth, and Barth very much has Heidegger in his sights. They are roughly contemporary with one another, but whilst Barth authored the Barmen Declaration, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933. By their fruits shall ye know them. What is Heidegger's philosophy? Well, there's a lot of it. But for what we need to get into, the clue is in the name, phenomenology. Heidegger thinks philosophy begins with phenomena, from the Greek phaino, I shine. He thinks things, experiences, events shine out and impose themselves, and that is the starting point of our thinking and engaging. Our role is to attend and engage, and in this engagement we have to strip away interpretations, convention, even language. This way of looking at things is quite hard to square with a sensible Christian outlook. First, because it seems to locate ultimate existence with things and events. Second, because it is highly individualistic and against established collective, communal ways of living and thinking. But what Marion picks up from this way of thinking is something different, which is also there. You remember the odd thing that happened around the 16th and 17th centuries as we moved from the medieval world into the early Enlightenment? Just when in science we were getting the idea that we are not at the centre of everything, at the same time in philosophy we were going the other way, becoming the centre of our own universe. For the last 400 or 500 years it's all been about my experience. That's where philosophy and theology start. Descartes' starting point is I think, therefore I am. Schleiermacher, as we saw in week 5, starts with my feeling of absolute dependence. We start with ourselves and work outward. And Heidegger says no. It starts with the phenomenon, not with my reaching toward, thinking about, looking for, having an intuition of the phenomenon, but with the phenomenon. Out there. So, in a very odd way, this is leading us back to where we were with the medievals, that, as Coleridge says, all truth is a species of revelation. This is where Marion puts the two together. He says Christ is the ultimate saturated phenomenon, the pure starting point, who shines in the darkness whether we are there to see him or not. We do not seek to know him. He gives himself to be loved, and he comes among us to love him. Marion offers us a thoroughly baptized phenomenology, and personally I think he's rather wonderful. He brings out of this treasure house some really helpful concepts. Please look out for them, and others you may spot as you read. His notion of the icon, in which we look at the Son and see the Father, is fascinating. And it comes with another way to account for the strange invisibility of the Holy Spirit that we have noticed in weeks gone by. We must not lose sight of Coakley's well-grounded observations about the struggles of a church preoccupied with order and run by men to tune into pneumatology. But Marion has a really interesting alternative line of thought about how the Spirit is in us, making us able to see iconically, and then just as you don't see your sight, we thus don't see the Spirit, but we see in the Spirit. And this may be another way to account for the relative invisibility of the Spirit in our doctrine. He pays your money and you takes your choice, but attend to what he says and then hold it up next to what Coakley says. Then again, Marion helpfully sets out two concepts of oneness. He contrasts unicity with unity. Unicity for him, and he's adopting these as terms of art, unicity is simply being one of something. Unicity is the notion of oneness that underlies what he calls the monotheism of subtraction. But Trinitarian monotheism is a matter of unity, a oneness that is a uniting of more than one. Interesting. A very helpful concept to keep in mind, for example, if you're engaging in interfaith dialogue with Jews and Muslims. The Muslim monotheism is a monotheism of unicity, and therefore seemingly at odds with I think probably literally, sadly, at odds with the Christian monotheism of unity, in Marion's terms. So roll those concepts around in your head and see what they do for you. Besides these, you will find many other good things as you read. You will need to concentrate, for though this is a short book, it is dense. But notice that no matter how complex his ideas are, he keeps bringing them back to the scriptures, holding both in tension and making his quite obscure and difficult ideas cash out in ordinary language. See how he uses the scriptures, and indeed how he uses citations from the Fathers and from Karl Barth to triangulate what he is saying. Are these just window dressing, or do they show clearly the foundations and integrity of what he is doing? If the latter, there is something to learn from him about how to write a good essay. Lastly, this book, with its very wide range of reference through the history of Trinitarian theology, is quite a good way to check that we have learned something in the last couple of months together. Do you understand Marion better than you would have in August? What do you understand now that you would not have understood then? I very much look forward to hearing what you make of him when we meet. Now, as this will be our last class together, I really do want to put you on your mettle once more to grasp, before we part, the whole story arc of how the birth of a refugee baby to a teenage mother in a chilly outhouse in the Judean hill country made it necessary 2,000 years later for us to study the doctrine of the Trinity, and gave us a doctrine to study. The key thing I want you to take from this is that the doctrine is an attempt to say something about that which we are not really able to speak of. We saw when we looked at Barth how Wittgenstein, Barth's contemporary, had concluded his groundbreaking apple cart upsetting book, rather similar to Barth's commentary on the Romans. Wittgenstein's is called the Tractatus Logica Philosophicus. Wittgenstein concludes, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent. Fine for you, Ludwig, because you are not a minister of the gospel. But we have to speak. So, yet we are not able to speak of it. And that's what the Trinitarian endeavour is about. It is a long struggle to open our minds wide enough to admit something of the immensity of God. Not that this is the only way to know God. God can reveal himself to us however he likes. But if we are going to share what we have known, we need the common currency of language. And that is the point of theology, a language to speak truly of God. It is not an easy language to construct, and it needs to be maintained. An easy language to construct is a language to speak of objects in the universe. But what do we know about God altogether now? God is not an object in the universe. It is our job, therefore, to maintain this language that we use for this sacred purpose, and to do that we need to know where it comes from. Thus, at the start of our class, I want to challenge you to recall this story in its entirety. The events of the Gospels happened. Was this doctrine? No, it was stuff that happened. But when the people came to give an account of it in the world around them, that was quite hard. So much had happened, and much of it seemed contradictory. And what was distinctive about the world in which they had to give an account of it? It was a Greek-speaking world, a world of philosophy, analytical thought, argument. The story the church had to tell in this world was a Hebrew story, a story of law, people, place, obedience. Then, within this culture, there was conflict. Different people had different ideas how you told the story, and they bounced off one another, each provoking others to deep thought. Was there an orthodoxy defended by the fathers and challenged by the heretics? Not so much. There were followers of Jesus doing their best to say what that meant and who Jesus was, and the ones who won out we now know as the fathers, whilst those whose ideas didn't make the grade we think of now as heretics. And what was the difference between the two? Well, there were many. But often we find the orthodox are the ones willing to sit with two seemingly opposed principles and admit they don't know how you reconcile them, whereas the heretic wants to choose one or the other. Heresy is often a stable but wrong position. Orthodoxy a perilous balance, never quite right, but never letting go of any part of what has been revealed. How long did this go on for? Hundreds of years. By the start of the 4th century, though, at least the questions were clear, and the biggest question of all was, what was the biggest question? Is the Son of God co-eternal with the Father? That was what was at issue in the Arian crisis, and this was the focus of the Council of Nicaea, assembled in 325, to see off Arius, really, who had taught that there was when he was not. And what was the most important thing that got into the creed at this point? The homoousion, the statement that Son and Father are of one being. And why was this controversial? Why? Because scarcely 60 years earlier, Paul of Samosata had been condemned for the plainly wrong teaching that Father and Son were homoousios in the sense that God divided his being, placing some of it into Jesus. Yet there it now was in the creed. There thus followed a further 50-odd years of argumentation to try to work out how this could be. Who was the protagonist here? Why, the highly combative Saint Athanasius. And what was his key contribution? The idea, which he gets from Origen, his fellow Alexandrian, that the Son is eternally begotten, but not following after. There was not when he was not. And who were the three theologians we now credit with the first tentative statements of how this all fits together? The Cappadocian Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. They taught respectively that the three persons were equal, but that the Father was the source of divinity, that the three persons act together in a single action, and that the three persons are united in a perichoretic union, whatever that means. Then the scene shifts to North Africa, a further 50 years on. Augustine writes De Trinitate, and there are two really important things in it. What do we take from... Let's not be simplistic about it. Read the book again and again and again. But if you're going to take two things home from De Trinitate, what are they? First, the grammar of divine simplicity, as Lewis Ayres calls it. God is simple. He is what he has. There are no accidents in God, no changeable surface qualities. Yet Father, Son, and Spirit are all one being, yet distinct. And what distinguishes them? It cannot be their being, for they are homoousios. It cannot be anything transient or superficial, for nothing about a simple being is transient or superficial. No, they are distinguished by their eternal relations with one another. And second, the psychological analogies. Lots of different situations where we notice in our own minds, or indeed the world around us, where three distinct things are yet each of them the whole. The most famous, but not the only one, being memory, understanding, and will. Now fast forward to the Middle Ages. What has changed? What are the big, profound changes in Trinitarian doctrine between Augustine and the Western medieval schools? Well, there aren't anything. There aren't any. Nothing fundamental has changed. Many of Augustine's concepts have been helpfully elaborated and developed, though Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are now perhaps over-identified to a misleading degree with memory, understanding, and will, respectively. What is the key in Anselm's outlook? What's the big thing in Anselm? Perfect being theology. Perfect being theology. He says God must exist because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and God who did not exist would not be as great as God who did exist. Simples. Get out of that one. From this comes the concept of aseity, the quality of being sufficient in oneself, being a cause, not an effect. For Anselm, God must have aseity because there has to be something that causes everything else. This is the basis of his doctrine of divine simplicity, with which he retells Augustine's story in full technicolor, as it were. Then 200 years later, this is the same story Thomas Aquinas tells, again with more detail and subtlety, particularly when it comes to the processions. Thomas, however, has a greater volume of authorities and traditions to synthesize and reconcile, including the rediscovered Aristotle. So what happens here? What is particularly piquant for the development of our ways of thinking? In Thomas, we begin to see reason starting to play the dominant role in determining what is true. And this raises the curtain on the next stop, the 18th century, where we find a completely new world. What has changed now? Well, a good deal. Critically, from the point of view of our way of thinking, what has changed is that we are now the centre of the universe. Not God, not tradition, not received authority. Me. Anselm and Thomas knew that truth had to come from beyond us, and reason's job was to interpret and clarify. But now, in the 18th century, we think we can take hold of truth by independent thought and observation. 100 years on, and we will have added feeling into the mix besides reason. And so we come to Schleiermacher. What is the unusual feature of Schleiermacher's doctrine of the Trinity? The unusual feature of Schleiermacher's doctrine of the Trinity is that it is not the greatest possible doctrine of the Trinity in Anselm's terms, because it doesn't exist. He really doesn't have one. You may think he has one. If you want to come back at me and say he's got a doctrine of the Trinity, bring it. I think he just put it at the back of the book to be polite. Christ and the Spirit in the Church are truly divine. That's all he wants to say. And he thinks that that's not too hard, whereas we know from our struggles with the first 4 centuries that that's really quite a hard trick to pull off if you don't want to rush anything under the carpet. But at any rate, Schleiermacher sets the course for 100 years. And by the way, I do not wish to disparage Schleiermacher altogether. I think he has much to offer in the lyricism of his treatment of religious experience and as an apologist and in many other ways. But I think in Trinitarian terms, we have to question him. So what happens at the end of the 100 years that begins with Schleiermacher? What's the big event that has an impact on the history of ideas and the history of faith? It's the First World War. And I'm recording this on Remembrance Sunday. So having just spent 6 minutes at the War Memorial reading out the names of all those men who went out from the very, very small village of Roehampton to fight in the First and Second World Wars, sometimes 2 or 3 of them together with the same surname. If that doesn't change, if that doesn't challenge our theology, then we're not paying attention. And who is watching all his Hegelian and Schleiermacherian professors sign up for the Great War? Karl Barth. And what conclusion does he draw? Their theology, if it leads to the Somme and to Verdun, must be wanting. In response, Barth says 2 things. What does Barth say? First, he says, God is in heaven and you are on earth. So let your words be few. Oh, he didn't read that bit. He went straight on and wrote lots of books. God is in heaven and you are on earth. We are not in control of the truth. The more firmly we grasp the truth, the less true it is. Then this drives him, secondly, back to the Trinity. What is Barth's doctrine of the Trinity? God reveals himself. This is Barth's Trinitarian structure of revelation. After all these years, something that is really new. And we'll see when we come to Marion. Again, rather as Anselm works out Augustine, Marion works out Barth. This is something new. God is how and what God reveals. God remains utterly beyond and unknowable. The Father, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. God comes into the world. Jesus, the carpenter's son from Nazareth, walking beside the lake, eating fish. God is in us, the power to see the Son and know the Father, to see the man and know God. And yet, there is but one God. So, and this is one other huge important point to take home, the questions of what we know and how we know it are bound up with the doctrine of the Trinity. This then brings us to the mid-20th century. Then we have seen 3 or 4, if we include Marion, of whom we will speak on Monday night, contemporary theologians, all with their own way of talking about God as Trinity. Moltmann with his challenging idea that the Son dies on the cross, not the death of God, but death in God, and then the challenge, as we saw, that this poses to the doctrine of divine impassibility, which we may or may not wish to preserve. And again, I think this is something I need to press you to have a view on. I think I do know what's right and wrong here, but I really want you to own it. Can we meet the theological need that Moltmann rightly discerns as he reads the Gospels in the light of his experience in the Second World War? Can we meet that need with the Chalcedonian definition, or do we need to junk a whole load of stuff that we've hung on to in order to make way for his strangely, deeply Trinitarian notion that God dies on the cross? That is to say, the second person. Then Zizulus, mining the Cappadocian Fathers, articulating his idea, for which he disclaims originality, and which he helpfully summarizes in the title of his book, that being is communion, and that our notions of personhood and existence are or should be deeply shaped by the Trinitarian speculation that has gone before us, that our rich notion of a person is one that was originally forged in order to say something about who God is and what it is for anything to be. And then Coakley, rereading the Fathers in a broader perspective, challenging them to return to the task they set themselves, but which, in part because of the historic maleness of the Guild of Theologians, they have not completed fully, of giving a full account of the Trinity, of the disruptive and undefinable third person of the Trinity, and in the process bringing in all sorts of other interesting things and challenging us to think of the difference between chaos and a right ordered fluidity of desire, a topic very pertinent to our own time. And then, of course, lastly, Marion, of whom we have yet to speak when we meet. Got all that? Well, let's go through it and see if you have, and I look forward to sharing this time with you.